You are very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup with me, Roisin Chleirigh.
And me, Paul Brophy. Roisin, who do we have lined up for this week?
Well, the lineup we have for this week is the cost of living is rising and expected to escalate in the coming weeks and months. On this week's show, we are discussing the impact of the rise of the cost of living on one-parent families, senior citizens, and people living with disabilities, small local traders and businesses within our local communities and our high streets and surrounding streets, and start-up businesses. We'll also be discussing the mental health and well-being in these issues relating to the rise of cost of living with people living in these communities. Our guests to discuss these very topics are Kiernan, CEO of One Family Ireland, Ireland's organisation for one-parent families, people sharing and parenting and separating, broadcaster and former president of the GAA, Nicky Brennan, who is an ambassador for age-friendly Kilkenny, Tina Delaney from Mental Health Ireland, and Professor Thomas Cooney, who is a Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Technological University Dublin, Academic Director of the Institute for Minority Entrepreneurs.
Karen, we'll come to you first. We're experiencing the biggest cost of living shock since the 1970s. For any households, the costs of food and fuel are rising. General everyday living expenses are escalating, but for single parents, there are even more challenges. Many are already living in poverty, and the cost of living crisis is having a disproportionately high impact on one-parent families, and are pushing more one-parent families into poverty. And children in one-parent families are 4 times more likely to live in poverty than two-parent families as well.
That's right. And we're seeing this for a reason. It's not that people who are parenting on their own in Ireland are not incredibly hardworking and ambitious and tenacious. They have to be to survive. It is because the way we have structured society in terms of our services, social welfare laws is really geared towards two-parent families. And we all know how difficult it is in Ireland to pay for the biggest costs associated with a family, which are generally are childcare and a roof over your head. Really difficult to do on 2 incomes, practically impossible on 1 income. So that, coupled with now the rise in everyday items that everybody needs, we know we're hitting all the poorer groups disproportionately because they're must-haves. You have to keep your heat on if you can. You have to put food on the table. You have to pay your rent. But what we're seeing in One Family from working with lone parents is that many mothers and fathers are making really difficult decisions on a week-to-week basis about what they can pay for. And people are feeling very, very ashamed and really affected because their children cannot participate in society the way they'd like to. They can't go to birthday parties. They cannot do after-school activities, any of those things. So it really is a crisis, but it's one that can be fixed.
Absolutely. And of course,
there's also with that, the living under the breadline with women and even men who are parenting alone. There's also comes with that, with not being able to participate in extra school activities or going to birthday parties. There's also a social stigma is added to that. So that's even going to become worse in the times to come.
Yeah, and that's what we see, that unfortunately, a lot of people parenting alone still experience a stigma and a sense of shame. And sometimes that might be their own stuff or things that they've grown up with. Given the society we live in, we know that there's a very strong history of marginalization and blaming of people who have ended up parenting on their own, no matter what reason. But it's also due to the structures, and it's how they're treated and the messages they're getting implicitly and explicitly that they're not the correct family formation, that maybe they're not a real family. And because they have to struggle so hard, they have to swim against the tide all the time. It is so difficult for them and their children to have a normal or adequate standard of living. So even for parents who are working, who are going back to college, who are minding their children, who are trying to do everything right, they could lose their home and be homeless. You know, we've far more one-parent families in homeless and emergency accommodation. They've the lowest levels of savings. They're the most socially isolated than any other group, not the bachelor farmers up the mountains. You know, it's actually mothers with young children. And it's really, really difficult for those children. We don't want them left behind. So people are making very difficult choices. We know that children have been more adversely affected in recent years than anybody else in the population, but children can't vote. So we have to be the voice to make sure that children are better looked after so they don't grow up in poverty, because it just impacts them then for the rest of their lives.
True.
And it does count too with one-parent families who are parenting alone. As you said, one wage is coming in. Now with the cost of living crisis, it's going to escalate and everything's going to become more expensive. Even getting children to school with petrol and food, cost of living, school uniforms and clothing. What are you hearing and what are you experiencing from your community on maybe the fear that they have and the anxieties of the cost of living, which is escalating?
Yeah, look, it's really real. We've been hearing about, you know, the fears and the costs are always there, but they've just, you know, rocketed up. And people have been really worried all summer. There's been a lot of concern about going back to school and the cost of uniforms, books, iPads, and the fact that it's nowhere near free. And that is something that we could achieve in Ireland, is universal free access to school, and it wouldn't cost that much money. So that is doable if the government made that decision. And in terms of every, you know, on a weekly basis, trying to balance the costs of the rent, the food, normal activities, clothes, bills, it is really difficult. And sometimes bills have to come down the line, or sometimes the parents' access to food has to come down the line because other things are more important. People often prioritize their rent, and we know how expensive rents are because they don't want to become homeless. That is absolutely the worst thing for them and their children. So they have really, really difficult choices to make to try and, I suppose, anchor themselves and their families in a way so that they can, you know, try and survive. But it is really difficult, and they need help, and that just adds to their sense of vulnerability, stigma, and possibly shame or guilt about their family. So it's really important, we think, that the government makes choices that are based in evidence and research and targets in next week's budget at the families and children who need it most.
And Karen, you've obviously, you know, you'll be watching the budget very, very closely next week. What kind of measures are you looking to see in the budget, and what have our One Family Ireland proposing that the government should consider? Because there is talks that there's going to be approximately maybe 3 billion of a package to deal with kind of cost of living measures.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things that was calculated, and I think it was St. Vincent de Paul who did this, was that in order to stand still for people on social welfare, they needed an extra €15 a week. So now there's talk of €10 a week on every social welfare payment. Now, we know that children are already way, way behind where they should be. So we would like it targeted. We do not want to see another energy payment to everyone in the country. I am lucky enough that I don't need it. Other people desperately need it and more. So we've been saying this since last winter, is that it's really important to target payments and not just give one for everyone in the audience. That's not good enough. Then there's just the longer term things like making work pay for lone parents, not having them fall off an income cliff, you know, once they start working, and improving access to childcare and education. So there's a whole lot of things. There's a lot of barriers for people who are trying to get on that complicated road. There isn't a clear pathway. If you're an adult with a child on your own, in terms of how to earn enough money in a career to get off welfare and out of poverty, that's really, really difficult.
And even if we look at, you know, on television after the budget, they do their analysis, that, you know, someone will come on from KPMG and they'll say a couple, you know, guards, a nurse, you know, they never say a single person, a single parent, you know, they never give a breakdown to say how a person will benefit from this tax measure or not.
That's because they don't benefit from the tax measures. So in the last budget, there was an increase in the tax credit for single people and married people, but there's a specific childcare credit for single parents that one parent out of a shared parenting family can get, and there was no increase on that. So often there isn't anything, or there's something so minor that it's not even really worth discussing. But, you know, there are so many that are disproportionately vulnerable children who the government should be paying attention to ensure that they have a decent life. And you do that by targeting, and you do that by not looking at the populist who's voting, who do we need to meet, you know, their needs. And the squeezed middle is this, you know, idea which can be very true, but it's not everybody. There are lots of other people who need support. So I hope that answers your question, Paul.
Absolutely.
And Karen, no child, just like no human being, should go to bed hungry or cold, but even more so for children who are going to bed hungry, getting up in the morning to go to school hungry and cold, not being able to get a good night's sleep, and really just being sort of demoralized in that as well.
Yeah, this became really evident during COVID. Food poverty just became an issue at every single meeting. You know, there was so much work going on across our sector and with government departments around trying to problem solve and put in extra structures. And what we heard at every meeting, no matter what it was children and parents and families were hungry, because the systems that had been there to support them, whether that was school or breakfast clubs or youth clubs or childcare, were all closed. So suddenly, families had to try and pay for food, and food is more expensive if you don't have transport, if you're not near a large supermarket. You know, it's not the same. It's cheaper for some people if you can afford to get discounts and bulk buy. So for many people, that's not possible, and they're having to buy more expensive food, which may be less nutritious. So yeah, that is a huge thing, is access to good quality food. And as you say, warmth, light, electricity to be able to study, to grow, to be nurtured, to feel well. So I know Gina's going to speak about, the mental health impacts, but in one family, we do a lot of therapeutic support with children, young people and parents. And this is a huge issue, is trying to help people cope with the reality of their lives, even though it may be really, really difficult, whilst we also try to change some of the structural problems that they're having. But for many people, they're in a really invidious situation, and they just have to try and emotionally and physically cope with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Nikki, just like I've said, no child should go to bed hungry or cold, and no way should an older person or a senior person within our society should go to bed hungry or cold or wake up cold. You're on mute, Nikki.
Sorry, Roisin. Yeah, okay. No, of course, you're absolutely right. But in the same way as families, be it single-parent families or the whole diverse range of families around the country, older people as well come in various categories. There are some who are able to cope with a lot of the challenges, and there are others who are simply not. And they will be looking to the Minister next week to increase the old age pension. There's talks of that being increased by €10 a week, and that will cope with some of the challenges that are there. There are some other concessions relating to the cost of electricity or the cost of other fuels as well being talked about. They're going to be watched very closely, because for many families and many older people, they're in that dilemma. I mean, there's also the challenges that they face as well. If you take rural Ireland, and I know from Age Friendly Ireland, people in rural Ireland tend to, around this time of the year, as the evenings get darker, they tend to lock their doors and lock down because they're afraid from a safety point of view. There's many of those living on their own, and they're concerned as well. Now, when they get into their houses, in some cases, yes, they might be able to light a fire. If they're out the country, they might have access to timber or something like that. But a lot of people are looking now to perhaps buying an extra layer of clothing, and that's what's going to suffice over the wintertime, because they feel they're not going to be in a position to buy the sort of fuel that they would normally have been able to buy in the past because of the excessive costs. So this is causing a fair bit of stress among the older contingent of people. Not them all, because some have still got disposable income, and they're important as well. But I do think that it is a difficult time, as the previous speaker talked about, single parent families and the challenge that they're facing. That cohort of people, it's certainly very, very true. But it can be very, I suppose the thing about older people as well, they have life's experiences, Roisin. They've come through difficult times before. Paul referred to periods before when we had difficulties in this country. So they've lived through a lot of experience in Ireland of good times and bad times as well. So when they remember that, I mean, that can be very distressful. And then some of them might be coping with various stages of illnesses. So add that into the mix, and it can be very, very difficult for them. And they will be certainly looking to get help in the budget by way of increased old age pension and other supports as well. And
as regards those specific supports, Nikki, what will you be watching in particular with your age-friendly ambassador hat on?
Well, I suppose, Paul, the age-friendly, we would probably be a slightly different remit from the likes of Age Action Ireland that would be focusing in on the specific finances of a budget. It's not that it's not of interest to us, but age-friendly tend to be focused on service delivery from various stakeholders, be it the local government or numerous other partners, like in Garda Síochána, be it the business community, be it sports partnership. So there's a lot of focus on that. But of course, what comes in the budget will be of particular interest as well, because it's going to affect a lot of our people and members of the seniors councils around the country, in each county in the country. They will have a particular interest in that, but they'll also be looking to see what other supports might be out there in terms of fuel allowances, additional fuel allowances, and other sort of allowances that will help support them in their older age. That's what they will be looking for in particular. And I suppose they will be concerned as well that the overall cost, perhaps if you're living in the country or even if you're living in a city, you have to maybe pay higher charges for public transport or whatever it might be. Now, I know there's free travel and that as well, but there may be other areas where they'll be forced to pay for transport, because the simple fact of the matter is public transport is not always available in your area, and you may have to pay for taxis and that. So there's lots of other potential costs that older people have depending on where you're living. Of course, younger people have those costs as well. But for older people who want to get out and try and engage and interact with their peers to some extent and not be cocooned in their houses as they were for 2 years there during COVID, that's the sort of thing they'll be looking for as well. Is there something here that can help me to get back to normal living again insofar as I can, even though I'm heading into the maybe the later stages of my life?
And Professor Tom Cooney, you know, you are a professor of entrepreneurship, and you specialize in startups, but as well with people with disabilities and minority groups. How is all this sort of like rise of cost of living affecting your cohort of people?
Yeah, thanks, Roisin. So the area that we focus, as you say, on marginalized and disadvantaged communities, which include immigrants, people with disabilities, seniors, marginalized youths, travelers, and other, say, disadvantaged communities. And I suppose, first of all, is that, you know, during times of COVID, like what we noticed is that people from these communities were disproportionately affected in terms of employment. Okay, so it was people from these communities that were more likely to be made unemployed during that time. We also know from the crash of 2008, 2012, that people from those communities took longer to get back into employment after the crash. And therefore we were expecting kind of similar challenges at this time. Now, I suppose what we did find was that the economy recovered relatively quickly, and it obviously generated more jobs. But here we are in a situation now, again, with the energy crisis, particularly, where, you know, businesses are going to start cutting back, and they're going to start, you know, looking to minimize costs. And it's those who are on the lower income, the lower paid jobs, and the part-time jobs and the insecure jobs that are most likely to be affected. And that's most likely to be the disadvantaged communities once again. And unfortunately, the problem is that And in previous times, like my work is around promoting entrepreneurship and self-employment. You know, we would encourage self-employment, you know, within these communities, and we'd work with people from these communities to, you know, to evaluate their business ideas and to look for ways of enhancing the business opportunity. But the problem now is that the cost of starting a business in the next year is going to be prohibitive, right? So we're now in this real catch-22 situation, because they're going to be left go more likely, disproportionately, and the option of kind of starting up and doing it for yourself is less attractive. And obviously that's going to become a great weight on you know, on the state, because you're going to finish up with more people on welfare support. So yeah, it's really concerning. With regard to people with disabilities, we have already got the 4th lowest rate of employment for people with disabilities in the European Union. So our track record on employment of people with disabilities is shameful, and what people are paid is even more shameful. So, because you know, many are in low-paid jobs, so they also have the additional expense of their health expenses that the general population doesn't have. So you're on low income, okay, or the chance of you having a job are poor. The money you're making is going to be poor if you do have a job, and then you've got the additional expenses. You pile all of that on top of an energy crisis and what faces us, and I'm deeply concerned for some of the communities that I work with as we face into this winter.
Absolutely. And Gina, you've been sitting there very, very patiently from Mental Health Ireland. You're a development worker here in the southeast of Ireland. All of these pressures and all that, they can take a huge toll on our mental health, and I'm sure you've been kind of working away with various different stakeholders on kind of, you know, developing those tools and resources that you know, mental health is so well known for.
Thanks. Yeah. That's it. Like, you know, just kind of agreeing and empathizing, I suppose, with everything that everybody is saying. You know, and I suppose we're all experts in mental health, like, you know, because we all have mental health, you know, and we're all impacted on a daily basis. And I know that all the speakers, you know, are hearing what their groups that they're working with, how they're, I suppose, being impacted by it. And also, I suppose, you know, they're putting into place different measures to support those groups. In Mental Health Ireland, I suppose, yeah, like our role is around supporting and promoting mental health wellbeing and recovery. And as you say, we have lots of different resources supposed to support people, you know. So I suppose the thing is that everybody is at a different place, isn't it? Like, you know, and everybody is being impacted differently by what is happening to them and by what they're hearing, whether it's through, you know, on media or you know, friends, I suppose, and family that are struggling or, you know, might be worried as well. So I suppose there's certain things that we can do for ourselves to try and limit the impact on our mental health, and different things that we can do then, I suppose, to support and maintain our mental health then as well. So I suppose what I would be saying is to kind of to try and engage, you know, where am I at, like, you know, and what's going on for me, because each of us has something else on, isn't it? Like, you know, you know, whether it's kind of trying to struggle with, you know, being self-employed, or whether it is, you know, kind of hoping for more money to come in the pension, maybe having you know, additional health what would you say, like, you know, I suppose priorities, like, you know, that it costs more money as well as, you know, causing more worry in our lives. And then, of course, if you're a single parent, like, you know, all the different responsibility and trying to mind your children as well from the impact that's, you know, happening, I suppose, every day, listening to wars and pandemics, and now, you know, financial crisis and that. So I suppose, see where am I at? Where are we at as a family? Like, you know, or where am I at? And then see how you can limit, you know, what is coming in at you, like, you know. So of course we need to stay up to date, and I know there's a budget happening as well, and we'll all want to know about that. But I suppose, you know, decide where you're going to go for your information and when you're going to go for your information, because if you have it on
too much information out there.
Yeah, that's it. If it's on 24/7, and you know, you could have little ears going around the house and listening to the constant, I suppose, doom and gloom and fear and apprehension, like, you know. So being kind of proactive, I suppose, and intentional in the choices that you're making. And then I suppose to maintain your mental health, then there's lots of different resources that we have, and I suppose to encourage people to go on to the website to take a look there, you know, or people can get in contact, because you know, not everything is accessible online. But one of these tools is, it's called I Can Control. And there's, on the back of it then, there's a blank one, so I'd be happy to kind of get that out to anybody. But it's looking at, really, I suppose, putting everything on the page, like, you know, what is concerning me at the minute. You know, it could be financial, it could be, you know, a health priority, it could be, you know, children going back to school, whatever it might be. Put it all on the plate, and then decide, I suppose, well, what's in my control, and then I suppose what is outside my control, and just focus my attention and my energy and my efforts on what I can control, because otherwise our energy is going everywhere, isn't it? And then again, that's depleting, I suppose, our ability to manage and maintain our own mental health.
And Gina, you know, when you think about it, that, you know, the mental health, it can actually really come at you very slowly. You might be going overly stressed, a lot of anxiety, and it could just creep in on you. Then all of a sudden you actually could realize that, God, you know, maybe I need to have a mental health check here with myself and really focus on. And people might not realize that, you know, that mentally that everything's become overwhelming, because they could be stressed, and then the anxiety on top of that will affect their mental health. And mental health isn't just about, you know, having a mental illness. It can come with an overwhelming sense of a lot of stress and anxiety just being overloaded on them.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. And like, you know, I suppose it encourages all to see where we are at currently, because like we all have mental health, isn't it? Like, you know, whether we have a particular challenge or a particular diagnosis or a particular need, or whether it is that, you know, we just feel that we're being particularly impacted by, you know, certain things that are happening. Like, that is your mental health, and that is how it's impacted. And I suppose getting it as early on, and kind of that early help seeking, like, you know, and kind of reaching out for support, because, you know, it can feel kind of daunting, and you can feel a little bit like, you know, the shame and kind of can come into it, like, you know, oh, I should be able to cope a bit better or whatever like that. But at the end of the day, we are all human, and we are all impacted by it. And actually, by you reaching out and getting support or talking about how you're impacted, you're actually modeling really good behavior for somebody else who could be feeling, you know, as bad, or, you know, or maybe in a different way than you. But, you know, you're actually giving them the opportunity to say, well, maybe I could, you know, reach out as well, or maybe I could talk about it as well. So you could be doing someone a favor without even realizing it, you know. So definitely to, you know, if you are feeling impacted, like, you know, we all know the lines that are there, but maybe just to say them, like, you know, for emotional support, I suppose the Samaritans are there, is 24/7, and it's 116123, and the text line is actually very effective, and I get very positive feedback from people on these. Like, so the text line 50808. For information, then it's the information line is 1-800-111-888, and again, that's if you want any information around mental health for yourself or for somebody else. And the first port of call really for any kind of a conversation like that is, you know, after, of course, you know, someone you trust yourself, your GP, you know. So and again, I do hear people giving great feedback that, you know, maybe I was very, you know, nervous to open up, but when I did, I was glad I did, and I got a good response.
Absolutely. And sorry.
Go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, and Karen, as you mentioned earlier on, one parent family, you provide a lot of kind of therapeutic kind of services as well to kind of help lone parents with the challenges that they face. Have you seen a rise in your kind of people coming forward for help with the cost of living, and as Gina alluded to, like, you know, when we're in situations like this, it can become overwhelming for people.
Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, we're still dealing with the aftermath of COVID in terms of people's mental health. So we transferred all our services to telephone and online, and it just worked amazingly. People still really, really wanted help. For the first time ever, we've had to close our waiting lists for counselling because we simply had such a demand. We couldn't meet it despite additional funding, partly because so many people wanted help and support and were willing to look for it. Also because clients did not move on as quickly because they were dealing with so many difficult things during COVID. So I think for many families, this is just one more thing. And it's also very difficult to take the time to deal with your mental health or your education or your children's well-being or whatever it may be when you have such a crisis facing you that you're worried about hunger, you're worried about a roof over your head. So it's really hard, those priorities that you actually need to be strong enough to cope, you can't even get to when you're overwhelmed.
The last person you look after is yourself, because your sole focus is your family.
Yeah, even though you have to resource yourself as a parent to be able to do a good job. Yeah.
And then whether it's a man or woman parenting alone, their mental health and trying to keep everything together, trying not to let the children see that you're stressed away, putting on that happy face, even when inside you are just really stressed out and anxious about where you're going to get tomorrow's breakfast from, where you're getting tomorrow's dinner from, you know, how you're going to tell the children you can't put the heating on.
Yeah.
How you're going to tell the children they can't go to their friend's birthday party.
I mean, it's heartbreaking to think of that. And I suppose for a lot of the people who are using our services, whether the parenting services, helpline, employability, or the therapeutic services, they're actually trying to cope with the grief and loss of a separation. And they're trying to cope perhaps coming out of a very difficult or abusive relationship. They may be dealing with a lot of ongoing conflict in family law courts with non-payment of child maintenance. So there's a whole lot of very immediate issues that are quite big emotionally. You know, they're really big life events, and they're trying to cope with everything together, because when you go through a separation and ultimately perhaps a divorce, you're trying to make big decisions about money, children, homes in the midst of grief and loss and change. So it is really, really difficult. So for people to have that kind of emotional support during that process is really helpful. But unfortunately, that's becoming a bit of a luxury because there are so many other difficulties that people are facing.
Absolutely. And Nikki, as you mentioned earlier on, the Age Alliance, the Age Friendly, you're kind of pretty much very interested in how the various different services interact and how they can support older people. Are there any things that you'd like to see in the next little while that could kind of maybe, you know, strengthen that? Because the Age Friendly as a concept, it's you know, it's progressed a lot over the last number of years. Just on mute there, Nikki.
Just in relation, one of our guests there from TU Dublin and the area that he's involved in, the whole business development. In that area, I suppose one of the things I would suggest, clearly there are a lot of discussions have taken place, have been in the public arena, in the media, about retirement age and the opportunity for people to stay working. And I think that there are some people who genuinely want to stay working because it means a lot to them mentally, in particular, aside from maybe the financial benefits. Now, clearly that's going to be potentially problematic because the cost of the state and whether it can afford that, that's not a debate for tonight. But clearly there are many people within that area who will want to stay working. There are others who are happily, when they retire, they're happy to volunteer in a variety of areas. And indeed, many of the people on the Kilkenny Older People's Council are in that particular category. But in relation to businesses, I think one of the things I would want to stress is that the opportunity that older people bring to businesses. Now, we have in Kilkenny a shopping centre, Roisin and Paul are familiar with it, and Gina, McDonagh Shopping Centre, which was the first shopping centre in Ireland to be designated age friendly. But what does that mean? it means that businesses see older people as an important part of their customer support base. And they're able to do things in their shop, not costing them very much money, if indeed any money at all, but they provide various services there. They do things like lower the lighting. They don't have loud music on in the shop. They maybe have a chair there where an older person might like to sit down. An older person might be on medication and might need a glass of water. They don't have the product too high on the shelves that they can't see it. The signage is easily read and things like that. And then I know in McDonagh Junction, they have a discount a couple of hours on a Thursday. So I would like to see businesses in general being able to do that. Restaurants, for instance, that they shouldn't need to be asked for half portions. They recognize that sometimes there are older people. Now, there are some older people maybe might take 2 plates, but at the same time, there's others perhaps are happy to take a half portion. So be a little bit flexible, because there is a cohort of older people on there who are in a position maybe to spend a few bob when they go out. Yes, there's a lot out there who will be under enormous pressure and do not have such a luxury. So I would say to businesses, look on your older customer as an opportunity, and don't look on them as a hindrance when you're developing your business. And I'll say finally, and I keep saying this to people like the local authority, whenever you're making decisions about things you're doing in your area of responsibility, be it in the local authority area, for example, always think that someday you, the person who's involved in making a decision, you will be old. And how would I like to see that then when I come to the age where I'm a bit older? Am I going to be able to avail of that service, or are we putting obstacles in the way of older people? But that's deviating a bit from our topic on this discussion. But when I have the opportunity, I thought I might as well take it.
Absolutely. And a lot of those measures, Nikki, they can be applied to various different people as well. So like the low lighting and stuff like that. If you have someone has a child or an adult with autism or something like that, it benefits the wider community as well. These small measures, but they can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Well, again, if I go back to McDonagh Junction, they have 4 types of parking in McDonagh Junction. They have parking for the general public, they have parking for older people, they have parking for expectant mothers, and they have parking for parents who have children with autism. So they are recognizing a broad range of their customer base and how there's a need to consider their requirements within a shopping environment. Now, we want to see that happening more. McDonagh railway station in Kilkenny will shortly be an age-friendly railway station. Now, again, I'd like to think that becoming age-friendly will also mean it will be equally helpful to people with various challenges and difficulties in their lives, that they will be able to avail of it. So there's probably a need for a lot of the different services to look at one another and compare and maybe support one another as well in terms of the delivery of various services. And I know this is, and I want to stress, this shouldn't be about the financial cost of doing things. This is more often about people changing their behaviour.
Exactly.
And I would say, Tom, that you would sort of agree with what Nikki Brennan is saying, especially from a business point of view and for representing people with disabilities and minorities. The same maybe sort of practices with anybody coming into a business, that, they make the same allowances what Nikki just spoke about for people with disabilities.
Well, first of all, I think the problem with much of the discussion around minority communities is that they're seen as costs, right? People don't see them as benefits, right? And we've got the wrong mindset. Okay. First of all, I want to pick up on a couple of things that Nikki said. I read a report from the BBC last year where anybody over the age of 50 who was made unemployed, they have a 1 in 10 chance of becoming employed again. Now, that is a dreadful, dreadful statistic. And that people are put onto the scrap heap of employment, okay, just because they're 50 plus, right? Given all the experience, all the knowledge, okay, all the expertise they've built up. And what I found really interesting recently was I heard John Brennan of Kinmare Park Hotel. And what they're doing in Kinmare Park Hotel is that they were, staff in hotels, as we know, is really difficult to get and keep, right? And what they found is they were employing young people, and if they gave out to the young person left, right? And they were struggling to keep. So they created a program targeted at older people who were retired from full-time employment, who wanted a job for a couple of days a week, didn't want a full-time job, but wanted the social interaction, wanted the extra money, felt they had something to contribute, felt that they were still employable. And so they've created a program that employs older people, and they employ them on a 2, 3, or 4 day week. Okay, that's flexible for the person, while at the same time being good for the hotel. And what the hotel is getting is people with experience, people who know how they'd like to be treated as a customer, right? And so the older person is seen as a resource rather than as a cost, right? And the other thing I would say here regarding the older population is that one of the growing categories of entrepreneurs in America are senior entrepreneurs. Okay, again, people leaving, finishing their job or being made unemployed, they may have an empty nest syndrome. They may have been given a redundancy package. They may have, the managerial experience. They may have, an expertise. And instead of wanting to be finished, they might choose to be finished, right? That's a different argument. But instead of kind of going, oh, I'm on the scrap heap, in America, the biggest growing category of entrepreneurs is senior entrepreneurs. And it's one of the areas that we're looking at. I just got funding for research actually on senior entrepreneurship in Ireland, because it's one of the programs that we're looking to develop, because there is a resource, not a cost.
Absolutely. And I suppose, Gina, kind of carrying on from a lot of things Tom is saying, it's so important, even after whatever age, to have that kind of purpose and that kind of, feel that you can contribute as well.
Yeah, definitely. It comes up all the time in our workshops, like I suppose that importance, and it's within the definition for well-being and for what mental health, like, your ability to feel that you are contributing in some way, in whatever way is meaningful for you, because like, being able to contribute to society is different for everybody, isn't it? Like, so, but it is so important, because it, corresponds to how we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem, our self-confidence, as well as financially, of course. Like, one of the actual proposals for the mental health reform have put in their budget submission, and one of their proposals is for funding towards it's called individual placement support, and it is where people who have experience of having a mental health challenge are supported to get back into employment, and it's a very structured support that works with the employer and with the person themselves, and there's some great success stories from it, because again, I suppose that's another group of people who would challenge with getting back into employment when they had faced a difficulty and maybe come out of the workforce or taken a break from the workforce. So that's, I suppose, a really valuable way as well, and employers would say that because of that process they have I suppose, like the Brennans with the hotel, it's like such a good idea, isn't it? Like, just engage with people and let's work through it and see what we need to, I suppose, try to
say everybody has something to give.
And Tom, if I can come back to you as well, and small local businesses within our high street and surrounding streets, and self-employed people, they're the people who are most likely to employ people with disabilities, single mothers, and even teenagers. And in many households, teenagers from lone parents also contribute to buying food, helping the parents pay the gas or the electricity. So small local businesses and self-employed people are instrumental in helping people within our community.
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges of COVID, for example, is where young people didn't get the opportunity to work summer jobs and to grow up and to take responsibility, and that like that's how we grew up. We grew up taking summer jobs, and we came home complaining to our parents about, the boss that we had or whatever, right? And we're told, well, that's life, get on with it, right? And it is, that's life, get on with it, right? And what I'm noticing with young people that I work with is that those kind of experiences, they've missed out on those. And so from a mental health perspective, I think that's hugely important. And in case of personal growth and development, it's hugely important. And I think I'm concerned that if businesses are going to be cutting back, then those opportunities for young people, for people who want to work on a part-time basis because of their circumstances, for example, people with disability who are managing their health, won't get the opportunity to go into the workforce and experience, part-time work or interact with colleagues at work. And that's hugely important, not just for financial reasons, but also mental health and personal growth, as I said. So I think the one thing I would ask business owners is that we've got to be flexible in terms of how we think about employment. The notion of 9 to 5, okay, that you clock in at 9 and you clock out at 5. As I've often said, okay, it doesn't matter, if the hours you put in, it's what you put into the hours, right?
Exactly.
So, we've seen through COVID and we've seen through remote working, it is possible to be flexible. It is possible to find new ways. And as the John Brennan story showed, with a little imagination, we can introduce innovative, creative employment models that's inclusive of all of our society. And with regard to disability, I love the term that Tim Shriver of Special Olympics Worldwide uses. He talks about diffability, i.e. different abilities. And that, we all have different abilities, different strengths that we can bring to the workforce. One final example, there's an organization in Denmark called Specialist Turn, and they only employ people with autism.
Right.
And then they subcontract those people to normally IT companies who are experiencing IT problems that their own employees cannot solve. And because someone with autism is coming at it from a different place and thinking about it differently, they can solve the problem that the employees within the company cannot. So autism is seen as a strength. It's seen as a resource. It's seen as a positive that can solve problems that others can't. And then when they finish their contract in that company, they go back to Specialist Turn, and then they get subcontracted to a different company. So look, it's about being imaginative in how we employ people and seeing the strengths that different categories bring to the workforce, and getting away from 9 to 5 and that notion that, if you're not in at 9, then you're not doing your job properly. We need to think a little more imaginatively than that.
And Karen, I would say you would agree with Tom there that about the flexible working hours. Single mothers, single fathers trying to get their children to school, then get them to school, get them into, and then get to work. And then if the children are sick, the school phones the parents, and the parents have to go and collect the children. So even that parents who are parenting alone, being able to have that flexibility and going to work, and not only the flexibility in going to work, but also the mental health, because that could be the only social interaction that they have outside the house.
Yeah, that's all really true. And in Sweden, you can get time off if your child is sick, or if your grandchild is sick, so actually they're very family friendly. And a lot of the things that help older people or people with disabilities will also help any parent, never mind somebody parenting on their own, to be able to participate and do better. Interestingly, shift work is one of the things that lone parents find incredibly difficult, because you cannot get childcare. So they're happy to do the school hours if someone else would like to do the earlier, later times. We work in the area of employability as well. and trying to, what we have seen is that parents who've kind of come through adversity and education and into jobs that can be incredibly loyal to their employer, and with some flexibility and kindness, you know, they can be incredibly helpful, loyal, long-term employees, but they don't fit the traditional mold perhaps of being available for 40+ hours a week. So it is around trying to reimagine it. It is around being accommodating for people's individual needs. We also know that there are more people with disabilities who are also parenting on their own, and they have more children with disabilities. So there's lots of intersectionality as well. So in terms of the groups you're speaking about, Tom, you're not specifically mentioning lone parents in them, but actually I know that you would have lone parents in all of those groups. Equally, we have in our employability programs, you know, so people may need extra supports to be able to participate in society, earn enough money to raise their families. And it's just a win-win all around. And unfortunately, what we see are very structural barriers from government around, you know, blocking access to education and to jobs for lone parents, as well as some employers not being understanding.
Yeah, we're sort of coming to a close now, but if I could ask each of our guests, Karen, I start with you. If you could have a wish list of 3 things that you could ask the government to put into this budget for families that are parent alone, what would they be?
My big ask may not actually be budgetary, but what we would like is a National Child Poverty Action Plan with a unit that is resourced and can drive that plan over the next 5 to 10 years. We would also like a high-level civil servant group from across government departments to focus on the issues affecting one-parent families. Again, a strategic interdepartmental approach to dealing with the issues, because some of them are quite intractable and departments can be very siloed. And the last ask to government is to use the evidence and research that they have and to prioritise and target accordingly. And I won't need to ask for anything else ever again if they do that.
Nikki, what would your be 3 asks from the government for the older citizens and the more mature citizens of our society from the government for the budget?
Well, the most obvious thing clearly is that there will be recognition in the budget and increase in the old age pension. That's the most obvious thing that people will be looking to, because they need to cope with the whole cost of particularly energy. And I hope that there will be further considerations maybe to supporting some of the increased energy costs as well, in addition to increasing the old age pension. So I think the important thing, bear in mind that as well, that the houses that a lot of older people might be living in might not be as well insulated as other houses. So that's something that needs to be considered. So I'm not sure if that'll happen directly in the budget, but I do need to look. They need to look at how they can just make the whole houses of people a bit more comfortable and help them offset the obviously increase in energy costs that are going to be there for a period of time. That's going to be the biggest challenge. But all around us, costs are increasing in terms of food as well, in particular. And I think the government, I think it needs to keep its eye on the ball when it comes to that, and it needs to be calling in the different companies to account for some of the increases, because I have a suspicion myself that at times some of these increases that are coming on now, everything is being blamed on the war in Ukraine. And I think for others, this is proving opportunistic, and the people who are suffering are the type of people we're talking about on this program this evening. I'm specifically talking about older people, but I'm sure many of the other speakers would could empathize with what I'm saying here as well. I think there's a bit of a bandwagon developing here, and I think there's a need for government here to show leadership and call in those who maybe are unnecessarily increasing a lot of their services, as we've seen with some state bodies recently.
Thank you, Nikki. And Tom, what was your 3 wish lists from the government, especially either from the budget or right now for people from minorities, disabilities, and for the business owners?
I think the business owners generally are going to be well looked after in this budget. I expect there's going to be a suite of initiatives and packages, to support businesses in the year ahead. I'm not so worried about the general business population. I would definitely like to see changes in the attractiveness to work, making work pay, and because and particularly around supports for people with disability into self-employment. It's the single biggest barrier to self-employment for people with disability is the welfare trap, right? And people are afraid of losing medical cards, of rent allowances, of losing their benefits, right? And suddenly going from having some form of secure income to an insecure income. And unfortunately, our welfare system is this kind of binary system where you can either work or you can't, according to the government, right? That's their view. And so, but that's not the way it works, right? So for people with disability, they may be able to work at the moment, but there may come a time where that's not possible, where they've, their health needs time to recover, or they need hospitalization, or, so they move along a continuum, okay, between work and not work. And the system needs to recognize that. Like, here's a crazy situation. Someone I know in Cork who is an entrepreneur, got a great photography business going, and he is employing somebody because he needs someone to drive him to the weddings and to carry his equipment. It costs him an extra €30,000 per year because of the need to employ someone. Now, this particular character, right, is disabled and employing someone who's not disabled, and he gets no support. If the owner was somebody without a disability employing somebody with a disability, then they would get support. No, right? Now, how crazy is that? So we need the supports within the welfare system to encourage self-employment and encourage people, and to recognize that it's not you can work or not work. We need to be flexible and a little more imaginative and encourage people into work. That's one. And then just the second one is, away from the budget, we must have a policy, something like Karen was saying, about entrepreneurship for people with in minority communities. We need a dedicated strategy, entrepreneurship strategy, that recognizes the additional and distinctive challenges that people from minority communities face when starting their own business. One of the biggest failures in this topic of government and enterprise agencies is they continually fail to appreciate that people from those communities have additional and distinctive challenges when starting and managing their business. That needs to be recognized. Tailored supports need to be put in place, and then we can start talking about building an equal society. Thank you.
And Gina, Mental Health Ireland, what would be your wish, 3 things on the wish list for Mental Health Ireland in the budget for the people who are coming to use your services?
Yeah, so I suppose we've already heard it there as well around waiting lists and things like that. Like, so I suppose if and I know funding is not the answer to everything all the time, and we have acknowledged, I suppose, that sometimes it is about behaviour change, and the framework for recovery, is in place and looks at, well, how can we, I suppose, work in a more recovery focused way, but also we do need funding alongside that, like, so I suppose for the community and voluntary sector who are taking, a lot, I suppose, of the impacts that people have been faced with, over the last few years. So an increase there so that, I suppose, community voluntary sector can, I suppose, try and support people in the first instance. And then around sharing the vision, the mental health policy for sharing the vision, that does need some funding as well, to back up what's being asked for and looked for within that. So funding for sharing the vision. And then I suppose a personal love of mine is the area of advocacy. So advocacy supports, for people and, across the way, like within mental health, because, like, I suppose, whether you never had any barriers at all, when you access the mental health services, that in itself can throw up huge challenges. But if you're coming and English isn't your first language, or if you're coming and you don't know where your children are going to be minded or who they're going to be minded by, you know, so I suppose advocacy is just, you know, a massive area that does need great investment as well. So that'd be my 3 asks.
Absolutely. And well, time unfortunately has caught up with us. I'd like to say thanks to all our contributors, to Karen Kiernan from One Family Ireland, Professor Tom Cooney from Dublin Technological University, Nikki Brennan, age-friendly ambassador for Kilkenny, and Gina Delaney from Mental Health Ireland. I'd also like to say thank you to my co-host, Roisin ní Chleirigh. I hope everyone found, I'm sure I did anyway, definitely, our conversation very, very interesting and fascinating, and we'll be certainly keeping an eye on the budget next week and see what comes up, and we will have a breakdown and a summation of the budget next week, so stay tuned for that. So from me, Paul at Brophy, I'd like to say thank you, and everyone, hope everyone keeps well.
And it's a thank you from me too.